The soft clink of fine china and melodic piano music filled the air at La Maison, one of the city's most prestigious restaurants. Through the warm glow of crystal chandeliers, I watched a scene unfold that would change my perspective on wealth, respect, and the quiet power of standing up for what's right. It was a busy Saturday evening, and I was celebrating my parents' 35th wedding anniversary. That's when he walked in, a man in his 40s wearing a tailored suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. His presence commanded attention, but not in the way you'd admire. His wife, dressed elegantly in a black dress, seemed to shrink with each of his loud complaints about the wait time, despite having arrived without a reservation. Behind them trailed what appeared to be their family, elderly parents walking slowly, their faces etched with embarrassment as their son demanded the best table befitting someone of his status. The hostess, maintaining remarkable composure, explained that all tables were reserved for the evening. I couldn't help but notice his parents exchanging worried glances, their special evening already tainted by their son's behavior. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he scoffed, pulling out his phone to show his social media following. "I could buy this entire restaurant if I wanted to." His voice carried across the dining room, causing other patrons to shift uncomfortably in their seats. His wife gently touched his arm, whispering something, but he brushed her off. That's when Robert stepped in, a waiter I'd seen around the restaurant for years. There was something different about him, a quiet confidence that seemed to grow with each step he took toward the unfolding scene. He wasn't just any server. The gray at his temples and the way other staff looked to him suggested years of experience handling difficult situations. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. As Robert approached the group, a subtle smile played across his face. He carried himself with the kind of dignity that money couldn't buy, the kind that comes from years of understanding human nature in all its colors. The wealthy man turned to him, likely expecting another person to intimidate. The conversations around us hushed, all eyes drawn to this unexpected confrontation. Robert's next words, spoken so calmly they seemed to float across the restaurant, would leave an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed them. But before he could finish his response, something happened that made the millionaire's face turn a shade I'd never seen before. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with one of the restaurant's silver knives. Other diners had stopped eating, their forks suspended midair as they watched this story unfold. The elderly parents stood frozen, their special family dinner hanging by a thread. The wife's eyes darted between her husband and Robert, anticipating what would come next. In all my years of dining out, I'd never witnessed such a collision of worlds. Old money meeting new, respect facing arrogance, and humility standing firm against pride. What Robert did next would not only change the course of everyone's evening, but would teach a lesson about wealth and worth that no amount of money could buy. Just as the millionaire opened his mouth to respond, Robert reached into his pocket and pulled out something unexpected. The simple gesture carried such weight that it immediately silenced the entire restaurant. What happened in the next few moments would become one of the most talked about incidents in the restaurant's history, proving that sometimes the most powerful messages come from the most unexpected sources. From his pocket, Robert pulled out a worn leather wallet. The millionaire's expression shifted from anger to confusion as the waiter carefully opened it, revealing a faded photograph. "Sir," Robert began, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed to soften the tension in the room, "30 years ago, I was exactly where you are now." The restaurant remained silent, every ear tuned to Robert's words. I had everything: the cars, the houses, the attitude that came with thinking money made me better than everyone else. He gestured to the photograph, showing what appeared to be a younger version of himself standing proudly in front of a mansion, surrounded by luxury cars. The millionaire's scowl wavered slightly as Robert continued. "I believed success was measured by the size of my bank account until one evening changed everything." He glanced meaningfully at the elderly couple, who were now seated at a nearby table, their dinner growing cold as they watched their son with worried eyes. My own parents had saved for months to take me to a restaurant like this one. Robert's voice caught slightly, but he pressed on. They wanted to celebrate my success, to show how proud they were. But He paused, taking a deep breath. I behaved exactly as you are now. I embarrassed them, treated the staff like they were beneath me, and made what should have been a beautiful family moment into something they'd rather forget. The millionaire's wife had tears in her eyes now, her hand still resting on her husband's arm. Around us, other diners were completely invested in the story unfolding before them. I noticed a few discreetly wiping their eyes, while others nodded in understanding. But that's not the end of the story, Robert said, turning the photograph over to reveal something written on the back. 2 weeks after that dinner, everything changed. The market crashed, my investments failed, and I lost it all. Every penny. He looked directly into the millionaire's eyes. And do you know who was there for me when everyone else disappeared? The millionaire's facade was cracking now, his expensive suit suddenly seeming less impressive as he glanced at his parents. The father's eyes were fixed on his shoes, while his mother dabbed at her tears with a napkin. The same people I had treated as beneath me, my family, who I had embarrassed, and the working people I had looked down upon. Robert carefully returned the wallet to his pocket. They taught me that true wealth isn't about what's in your bank account. It's about. But before Robert could finish his thought, something unexpected happened. The restaurant's front door swung open, and a figure stepped in, someone whose presence caused Robert's eyes to widen in recognition. The newcomer took in the scene before them, and their expression suggested they knew exactly what was unfolding. The millionaire, now visibly affected by Robert's words, seemed torn between his previous arrogance and a dawning realization. His wife squeezed his arm gently, her eyes pleading with him to listen. The elderly parents watched anxiously, years of similar situations reflected in their tired eyes. The atmosphere in La Maison had transformed from one of embarrassment and tension to something else entirely, something electric with possibility. Every person present knew they were witnessing more than just a confrontation between a waiter and a wealthy patron. This was about to become a moment of truth, a turning point that would reveal whether money truly could buy everything, or if some lessons come at a different kind of price. The figure who stepped into La Maison was an elderly gentleman dressed in a simple but well-maintained suit. His presence seemed to fill the room with a different kind of authority, not the loud, demanding type, but the kind that comes from wisdom earned through years of experience. As he walked towards our group, Robert straightened his posture, a mix of respect and recognition crossing his face. "I thought I might find you here, Robert," the man said warmly, then turned to face the millionaire. "I believe you were about to share the rest of your story." There was something in his voice that commanded attention without asking for it. I later learned this was Mr. Chen, the owner of La Maison, and the man who had given Robert a second chance 15 years ago. The millionaire, still processing Robert's earlier words, looked between the two men with growing uncertainty. His wife had moved closer to his parents, who were now holding hands beneath the table, their wedding rings catching the light of the chandeliers above. The scene reminded me of a chess game where every piece was perfectly positioned for the final move. "You see," Mr. Chen continued, pulling out a chair and sitting down as if he were joining old friends for dinner, "Robert's story doesn't end with him losing everything." He gestured around the restaurant. "Sometimes life has a way of teaching us its most valuable lessons when we think we've lost it all." The millionaire's face had lost its harsh edges, replaced by something that looked almost like curiosity. His phone, which he had brandished earlier as proof of his importance, lay forgotten on the table. Around us, other diners had become so invested in the unfolding drama that their own meals sat untouched. Robert stepped forward again, his hand resting on the back of a chair. "When I lost everything," he continued, "I found myself here, at La Maison, not as a guest, but asking for any job they could offer. I remember standing exactly where you are now, but instead of demanding the best table, I was hoping for a chance to clean them." The millionaire's mother let out a small gasp, her hand covering her mouth. Her son's eyes darted to her, and for a brief moment, I saw something flash across his face, recognition, perhaps, or the first crack in a wall he'd built around himself. Mr. Chen leaned forward, his eyes twinkling with a mixture of kindness and mischief. "But before I tell you what happened next," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket, "there's something you should know about your reservation tonight." He pulled out an envelope, weathered and creased as if it had been carried for a long time. The restaurant seemed to hold its breath. The millionaire's wife had moved back to her husband's side, her hand finding his. His parents watched with a hope that only parents can have for their children, the kind that never dies, no matter how many disappointments they face. Just then, a waiter appeared with a covered silver dish, placing it carefully on the table beside Mr. Chen. The timing seemed too perfect to be coincidental, and I noticed Robert hiding a small smile. The millionaire stared at the covered dish, then at the envelope in Mr. Chen's hands, clearly trying to piece together what was happening. Mr. Chen carefully opened the envelope, pulling out what appeared to be an old newspaper clipping. "Before I show you what's in here," he said, his eyes fixed on the millionaire, "I want you to look at this dish." With a subtle nod, Robert stepped forward and lifted the silver cover, revealing not an elaborate meal, but a simple bowl of wonton soup. The millionaire's expression shifted from confusion to something deeper, recognition mixed with disbelief. His hands, which had been clenched at his sides, slowly relaxed. The soup's aroma filled the air, carrying with it memories that seemed to transport everyone present to another time and place. 25 years ago, Mr. Chen continued, smoothing out the newspaper clipping, a young boy used to come to my first restaurant, not this fancy place, but a small noodle shop in the old district. He would save his pocket money to buy this exact soup every Friday. He slid the clipping across the table, revealing a faded photograph of a modest storefront. The millionaire's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the paper. His mother let out a soft sob of recognition, while his father placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. The other diners leaned forward in their seats, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. That boy, Robert added gently, would sit at the counter and tell Mr. Chen about his dreams, how one day he would be successful, make his parents proud, own buildings taller than the sky. He paused, looking directly at the millionaire. And he always promised that no matter how successful he became, he would never forget where he came from. The millionaire's wife gasped softly, her eyes darting between her husband and the soup. "That's why you always order wonton soup when you're stressed," she whispered, realization dawning on her face. "You never told me why." But before anyone could respond, the restaurant's doors opened again. This time, an elderly woman entered, her silver hair neatly pinned back, wearing a simple apron. The millionaire's face went pale. Mr. Chen stood up, smiling broadly. "Ah, right on time. I believe you remember Mrs. Liu. She's the one who taught me the secret to that soup recipe all those years ago." The millionaire sank into a nearby chair, all pretense of superiority forgotten. His eyes were fixed on Mrs. Liu, who was now walking towards their table with the same quiet dignity that had characterized her cooking all those years ago. In her hands, she carried something wrapped in faded red cloth. The tension in the room shifted, taking on a new dimension. This was no longer just about a wealthy man being taught a lesson in humility. There was something deeper at play, a story within a story that was only beginning to emerge. The newspaper clipping trembled in the millionaire's hands as Mrs. Liu approached, and for the first time that evening, tears welled in his eyes. Mrs. Liu carefully placed the red cloth bundle on the table, her weathered hands smoothing out its creases with practiced care. "Your mother brought this to me this morning," she said softly, her voice carrying decades of unspoken history. "She said you might need it today." The millionaire's face crumpled slightly at her words, the carefully constructed facade of arrogance finally falling away completely. As Mrs. Liu unwrapped the bundle, she revealed a worn children's lunchbox, its metal surface scratched and dented from years of use. The millionaire's father let out a shaky breath, while his mother stepped forward, tears flowing freely now. Inside the lunchbox lay a stack of carefully preserved paper napkins, each covered in childish drawings of tall buildings and success quotes written in a young boy's handwriting. Every Friday, Mrs. Liu continued, after you finished your soup, you would draw your dreams on these napkins. Your parents couldn't afford drawing paper then, but they made sure you never missed your Friday soup. She picked up one of the napkins, showing a crayon drawing of a family standing together. The words, "When I'm rich, we'll eat here every day," scrawled across the bottom. The millionaire's wife gently took one of the napkins, reading the faded writing aloud. Success isn't about having money, it's about making mom and dad proud. The irony of these childhood words hung heavy in the air. Around us, other diners were completely silent, many wiping away tears of their own. That's when Mr. Chen revealed the final piece of the puzzle. Your parents didn't just happen to choose La Maison tonight, he said, pulling out one last item from his jacket. A deed to the restaurant. They wanted to be here when you received this news. You've been so focused on buying new properties, you never realized that this restaurant, the one you threatened to buy earlier, your parents have been saving for 30 years to buy it for you. The millionaire stared at the deed, his hands shaking. But how? He whispered, looking at his parents in disbelief. His father stepped forward, speaking for the first time that evening. We took extra jobs, saved every penny. Your mother cleaned offices at night. I worked weekends. We wanted to give you the one thing that meant the most to you as a child, this place where you first dreamed of success. Robert quietly placed a fresh bowl of wonton soup in front of the millionaire. Sometimes, he said gently, we become so focused on proving our worth to the world, we forget who we were trying to make proud in the first place. The aroma of the soup wafted up, carrying with it memories of Friday evenings spent drawing dreams on napkins. The millionaire stood slowly, his expensive suit suddenly seeming out of place among these fragments of his childhood. He turned to his parents, opened his mouth to speak, but instead pulled them into a tight embrace. The restaurant erupted in applause, not for the wealthy man who had demanded respect earlier, but for the little boy who had finally found his way back home. As the applause faded, Mrs. Liu stepped forward once more, this time holding a small, modern notebook. Every Friday, she said, even after all these years, your parents still come here. Your mother writes down her prayers for you in this book while your father counts his savings, both still believing in that little boy's dreams. She handed the notebook to the millionaire, who opened it with trembling hands. Inside were hundreds of entries, each dated for a Friday, containing his mother's hopes, worries, and pride in her son. The latest entry, dated just last week, read, I hope this restaurant reminds our son of who he really is, not just what he has become. The millionaire sank back into his chair, the weight of his parents' unconditional love finally breaking through the walls he'd built around his heart. Robert quietly began serving bowls of wonton soup to everyone present, the millionaire's family, his wife, and even nearby tables. Mr. Chen smiled, explaining, in all my years of running restaurants, I've learned that good food has a way of healing hearts and building bridges. But great food tells stories. The millionaire's wife gently touched her husband's arm, pointing to something tucked into the back of his mother's prayer notebook. It was a crumpled restaurant receipt from 30 years ago, the last time they had all dined together as a family. On its back was a hastily scribbled note in his younger handwriting. One day, I'll make you proud without needing fancy restaurants. Looking around the elegant dining room of La Maison, the millionaire let out a quiet laugh that sounded more like a sob. All these years, he said, his voice thick with emotion, I've been trying to prove my worth with empty gestures, when you were already proud of me serving soup on Fridays. His father reached across the table, squeezing his son's hand. Success isn't measured by the restaurants you can buy, he said softly, but by the memories you choose to keep. He pulled out his worn wallet, revealing a carefully preserved napkin drawing of their family, dated from all those years ago. As the evening drew to a close, I watched the millionaire hang up his suit jacket, roll up his sleeves, and join Robert behind the counter. Together, they served soup to the remaining guests, the simple act of service bringing more dignity than any show of wealth ever could. His wife took photos, not for social media this time, but for their family album. Mr. Chen turned to me, noticing how I'd been documenting the evening's events. You know, he said with a knowing smile, sometimes the richest moments in life happen when we stop counting our money and start counting our blessings. He nodded toward the millionaire, who was now laughing with his parents as they taught him how to properly fold napkins. Before leaving that night, the millionaire did something unexpected. He took one of the restaurant's napkins and drew a simple sketch, a family sharing soup, and pinned it to the wall alongside his childhood drawings that Mrs. Liu had preserved all these years. Below it, he wrote, "Success is remembering where you came from and who helped you get to where you are." As I finished my own bowl of soup, I realized I had witnessed more than just a wealthy man's humbling. I had seen the power of patient love, the strength of family bonds, and the simple truth that real wealth isn't counted in dollars, but in the moments we choose to remember and the people we choose to become. The next time you pass by La Maison, you might notice something different. Every Friday evening, you'll find a successful businessman serving wonton soup alongside Robert, reminding himself and others that true richness lies not in the ability to buy a restaurant, but in the privilege of serving others in it.